Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Firelight chat today. Today, we're having a conversation with one of my favorites. We're talking about different aspects of my whole health plan, how we have to transition from what we often call our healthcare system, but which has actually become a sickness care system, to a actual whole health care system, one in which we talk about what it means to be healthy and how we can actually create a healthier America. So, James Doty is someone that you might have read, you might have heard him on here or other places before. It was a while ago when I just couldn't stop talking about his book, Into the Magic Shop. But let me give you more specifics about his background so that you'll know who we're talking about today and why. James Doty, MD, is a renowned neurosurgeon, neuroscientist, compassion researcher, entrepreneur, and philanthropist. He is also the founder and director of the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education at Stanford University, of which His Holiness the Dalai Lama is the founding benefactor. He works with scientists from a number of disciplines, examining the natural basis for compassion and altruism. He is the New York Times bestselling author of Into the Magic Shop, a neurosurgeon's quest to discover the mysteries of the brain and the secrets of the heart. And his upcoming book, to be published in May of 2024, is called Mind Magic: The Neuroscience of Manifestation and How It Changes Everything. Hello, Jim Doty. Thank you so much for being with us today.
It's great to be with you, Marianne. It's always nice to see you.
I mentioned to you earlier that you and I like each other because we agree on things. Who doesn't like people who agree with them, right? Um,
Well, that seems to be the case.
you know, when someone coming from the kind of work that I have done, when we see people like yourself speaking as scientists, speaking as doctors, basically verifying so much of the spiritual information and knowledge, which is, of course, ancient wisdom, it means a lot. It means a lot in terms of ideas getting into mainstream culture. And of course, on a scientific and medical level, you are not just verifying old ideas, you are actually a pioneer in pushing things into the next phase of our evolutionary understanding. You and I have talked before about your book, Into the Magic Shop. And for those of you who have not read it, uh, Jim was taught at a very young age, as a child, some of what you later came to realize were some of the mysteries, really, of Eastern religion. And then as your own journey evolved and interfaced not only with your ability to succeed, but with your understanding as a doctor, everything sort of blew up and took you into this whole universe of intersectional understanding, which you, of course, have presented to the rest of us. So I think the first thing that would be great here is if you give people a little bit of understanding of your own journey, just as much as you'd like to, so that people can really understand how both sides of your brain um, perceive the whole in terms of what's going on today.
Sure, no, I'm happy to. Oftentimes, when people hear my background who don't know me, they assume I had uh, an elite education and came from a privileged background, which frankly is typically the case. But my background, in fact, could be nothing further from that. Or nothing more further from that. Anyway, I grew up in poverty. My family was on public assistance essentially my entire childhood. My father was an alcoholic. My mother had had a stroke when I was a child, was partially paralyzed, unfortunately, chronically depressed, attempted suicide. We were evicted from multiple residences. So you can imagine how scary, terrifying that is to be a child growing up in that type of situation, and also not to have guides or mentors or those who help you along. And I don't want to imply my parents didn't love me, because I know that they did. They just didn't have the resources. Plus, sadly, they did not have the tools to help themselves. And I think that's another very critical thing. But what changed my life was actually walking into a magic shop. That's the title of the book. And what happened was I had an interest in magic. There was a situation at home, and oftentimes when they would get challenging, I would get on my bicycle and ride as far and as fast away as I could. And on one of those journeys, I uh, rode by a strip mall, and they had a magic shop, which I had an interest in. I walked in, and there was a woman there who had this incredibly radiant, embracing smile. And it turned out she knew nothing about traditional magic. She was the owner's mother, and the owner, the magician, was running an errand. But we began talking. And what's interesting about that is that for so many of us, we need to feel psychologically safe to be able to communicate with somebody who accepts us for who we are, who's non judgmental, who recognizes your dignity. And that was how she treated me. And in fact, she treated me in some ways like an adult. She was interested in my response, and I was only 12 at the time. But this led to a conversation where she asked many questions, which typically I would not answer about my background. But to make a long story short, after conversing for 20 to 30 minutes, she said to me, "You know, I really like you. I think I could teach you something that could help you." And ultimately, I ended up spending 2 hours a day with her over a 6 week period. And clearly, her background had some exposure to Eastern traditions. And she taught me a practice which would now be called a mindfulness practice, and then a practice of self compassion. Because what happens is when you grow up in the type of environment I grew up in, it's like a war zone. You're traumatized. And in fact, many children who grow up in these types of environments have post traumatic stress disorder, which is not just limited to people in the military. And it makes it very difficult to concentrate. Frankly, it makes it very difficult to achieve. You feel insecure, things don't feel stable. And that's why so many children who grow up in these environments fail. And this is, in some ways, the origin of the ACEs, this adverse childhood experiences, that has become more prominent lately, recognizing these types of traumas. Regardless, though, what she did was teach me a way to actually to attend, to be able to relax my body, to concentrate, to understand that the negative dialogue that was going on in my head was not actually me. Uh, it was a narrative that I had created. And she taught me to change that hypercriticality to one of self affirmation. And when I was able to do that, it allowed me to see the world in a different way. Because if you're hypercritical of yourself, frequently you're hypercritical of those around you.
Mhm.
And it also allowed me to forgive my parents because I used to look at them as failures and that they had let me down. But I recognized that they were on their own journey, that they did not have the tools. And so I forgave them. But what I realized too is when I changed how I looked at the world changed how it looked at me. And that gave me an opportunity to transcend my background. And in fact, the last thing she taught me, and her name was Ruth, was a manifestation practice, and how to understand that within us, we have immense power. And so many people give their power away because they're waiting to get affirmation from somebody. And so often, those around you don't give you the affirmation, they are critical of you. And so, by understanding my own self agency, having a different perception of the world, one of loving kindness, acceptance versus hypercriticality, it allowed me to believe I could go to college, to medical school, become a neurosurgeon, become a professor, a successful entrepreneur. And I'm certainly forever grateful for that.
Now, you became a doctor, ultimately a neurosurgeon, and you have worked extensively, not only in the traditional aspects of Western allopathic medicine, but with the power of the brain as it relates to the things that you've just spoken about. And I've also heard you talk about the fact that there's a pathway between the brain and the heart that, even on a scientific level, was not previously understood. So much of what you were talking about when you were talking about the post traumatic stress of children, and as we know with some of these children, it's not even post-traumatic stress, it's present traumatic stress because it's triggered every day of their lives. How does this contribute to disease in America. We know that it contributes to mental anxiety. We know that it contributes to depression. What are the relationships there? How does all this fit together in terms of our understanding and effort to repair not only our bodies but our entire society?
Well, there are a couple issues here. First of all, we evolved as a species to care, connect, to love. And if you look at our offspring, we're one of the few species that our offspring require us to care for them and nurture them, not only for a decade, but a decade and a half, or maybe even two in some instances. And what happens, there is an immense cost in terms of time and resources. And what has evolved is that when you care, when you love, when you accept, as an example, you care for your child who's hungry or in pain or suffering in some way, actually you are rewarded. And the way you're rewarded is by having a positive effect on your physiology, as well as stimulating those parts of your brain associated with reward. And as a result, at our core, we evolved to care and connect with people. And whether it's in terms of the nuclear family or in terms of our tribe, and we can talk about tribal issues a little bit later here, but there is no question, and this is no longer having to be proved. When you are treated with kindness, when you're treated with respect, when you are loved, your physiology works its best. And the reason it works its best is because of its effect on the autonomic nervous system. We have what is called the stress response or the sympathetic nervous system response. And this autonomic nervous system arises in your brainstem. It's quite old and it's present throughout all the major organs in the body. It's a two-way pathway. And when that part of it, called the sympathetic nervous area, is stimulated, this is associated with the flight, fight, or freeze response. And as a result, you have the chronic release of stress hormones, which are deleterious to our health if they're chronically released. You have depression of your immune system. You have the production of inflammatory proteins, as well as it has a negative effect on your cardiac function. Conversely, if you are able to shift into engagement of your parasympathetic nervous system, it has the opposite effect. And if we look at situations such as what are called the blue zones, and these are 5 areas in the world in which people routinely live to 100, in every one of those instances, it's not just, oh, they eat the Mediterranean diet or eat a primarily fruit or vegetable based diet. The major contributor to their health, their longevity, actually is having a stable environment, a place where they're born, where they die, a stable connection to those around them. And regardless of what they do, they are still loved. They know they're loved. And there's been a study done at Harvard over the last 80 years that demonstrates the exact same thing, that this type of chronic engagement, if you will, of our parasympathetic nervous system has a huge, huge positive physiologic effect. And conversely, when you look at children who grow up in these stressful environments where there's chronic engagement of the sympathetic nervous system, it is very, very common for them to have chronic diseases, cardiac disease, uh, dementia, mental health issues, addiction issues, diabetes, a whole list of deleterious effects from the due to chronic stress, which translates into having a chaotic, traumatic, unstable environment that oftentimes does not have love at its core. And what's so sad about this is if we look at the prison system in the United States as an example, the people in the prison system primarily are not bad people. They are people who have not had the opportunity to be cared for and loved.
Many of them, of course, with a high rate of adverse childhood experiences. I mean, that's chronicled.
Absolutely.
So basically, what you're saying is that the randomness, or at least the experience of randomness, that is true for most people, this sense that all you are is a commodity, all you are is a consumer, there's no ultimate meaning to your experience. These is kind of like spiritual desert that we have created of our larger social order, you're saying is contributing not only to obviously decline in our mental health, that should be obvious to everyone now, but also to decline in our physical health, correct?
No, absolutely. There's no question. And again, this isn't even something that's debated at this point. That is fact. And thus, why we have to examine at a much deeper level how we got here and how we overcome this.
And what are your thoughts about that in terms of how we got here and how we overcome it?
Well, it's interesting because people tout capitalism. And I'm not necessarily against capitalism, but I'm interested in capitalism that also includes caring. I'm interested in not looking at what I can get to enrich myself, but how we can use the tools of capitalism to benefit everyone. And therein, we have a problem in the United States because we have ruthless capitalism. We don't have equitable or fair capitalism.
I think that that's becoming a mainstream understanding on both right and left at this point. We need to evolve beyond this sort of fear of saying the truth here. There is a malevolent strain of capitalism, uh, a soulless capitalism, vulture capitalism. You were just talking about ruthless capitalism, and it's not necessarily an indictment of capitalism itself. I mean, the truth of the matter is. Um, Adam Smith, the original architect of modern capitalism, said it cannot exist outside an ethical context. So, what I hear you saying that I certainly agree with, and I think a lot of people would agree with at this point, is that any economic system, no matter what you call it, that feels no moral responsibility or reverence or ethical responsibility to people or planet is destructive. It's destructive to the earth, obviously. It's destructive to our communities. It's destructive to our mental health, and it's destructive to our physical health. And then if all we do is think in terms of symptoms and how we're going to treat the symptoms without addressing the underlying cause, then we're never going to get anywhere. We're always just going to be in this constant cycle of disrepair. And so I think what you're saying is really important, that we have to name it. We have to name the economic element here. You know, so many times when people talk about the mental health crisis, there are too many people in officialdom who don't want to recognize the economic component here. If you have 70% of Americans who say that they live in economic stress, chronic economic stress, that's not only mental and emotional anxiety, but what you're saying is that it begins to tear down the body as well.
No, absolutely. And it's funny you mentioned that because I was recently on a panel with the California Surgeon General, as well as one earlier with the U.S. Surgeon General, where these topics came up. And I was asked to speak. And my comment isn't that, oh, well, let's just treat the problem. We have to get at the fundamental core of these issues. If we look at the prosperity of our economy over the last 50 years and see how that wealth that had been generated has been distributed, what we see is a destruction of the middle class, no significant increase in wages. And what's so horrible is we talk about a minimum wage. We should never even use that word. It should be a living wage. Uh, Several decades ago, an individual who, let's say, was simply a high school graduate or a blue collar worker, they could care for their family, they could have children, they could have a home or rent a home, have food on the table, be able to take vacations, go to a movie, own a car, and they were okay. Now we're in a situation, which you mentioned, which is economic insecurity, literally a large percentage of children in poverty with food scarcity, where parents don't even have more than $400 in the bank in case there's an emergency within their family. They don't have a retirement plan. They're trying to support a family on wages that cannot even support one person. This is a travesty. It's an obscenity, especially in the context of one of the most productive economies in the last decades. And if you look at where that money has gone, it has gone into the pocket of the top 0.01% of workers.
So you remind me of myself, Jim, because we have a very parallel track here. People bring me on to talk about spirituality, and I always veer it over. We got to talk about this rigged economy. You're the same way. Somebody wants to talk to you about neurosurgery and the heart and the brain. It always lets we got to talk about the economy. So when it comes to the economy, I couldn't agree with you more. When it comes to the economic disruption, injustice, etc., I couldn't agree with you more. And of course, my listeners hear that from me all the time because they know that. However, I don't know anything about neurosurgery and I don't know anything about the heart that's particularly of value. And I would like to go back, if I might, a little bit, because I think that, of course, what I talk about a lot in my campaign is Medicare for all. Um, because we do need to treat everyone. But once again, going back to how we create a healthier uh, America to begin with. Can you tell my listeners a little bit here about that business, about the heart and the brain? Because everybody gets it these days. The brain is the new pioneer space. Everybody's so fascinated by this, and would love to hear you talk about it because,
Well,
and of course, it has a lot to do with what you were talking about before, how children do in school and all of that.
yeah, I mean, the challenge is that if you only use your brain to look at the world, it's going to be a heartless world because
Mm.
it comes down to, in some ways, pure logic, which then translates oftentimes into me, which then translates into profit, then translates into self. Now, if you have that worldview, I would suggest that not only are you going to feel a chronic emptiness in your life, but it's also that type of worldview will ultimately affect your health. The other side of it is if you look at the world through the lens of compassion or through your heart, you understand that everyone is suffering and that as a species, we are fundamentally, and you were talking about spirituality, the fact of the matter is we are one. When you look at the other, you should see yourself. If you're able to do that, you never make a wrong decision.
Well, let me ask you, last week I had on Dr. Steve Farber, who is a cardiologist, and he was talking about how in treating heart patients, at one point he said to somebody at his hospital, the supervisor or whomever, he said, I would like to suggest meditation classes. I think that we would have a lower rate of heart disease if people meditated. And he talked about how much resistance he got to that. Can you talk about that a little bit? Like what is the physical relationship between you were talking about love, of course. You were talking about how when the heart is open, love, forgiveness, compassion, there's so many ways that this affects us physically. Can you talk a little bit about the physical effects of
Sure.
meditation, prayer, spirituality, love, forgiveness, and so forth?
No, absolutely. And what's interesting about this, first a comment, you had said earlier, we have a system of illness, not of wellness. That is a fundamental problem. We should look at the individual as a whole because we should promote health, not the treatment of illness. And what I mean by this is it should be much more at the forefront of having a good diet, having moderate exercise, having frankly, a spiritual practice, as well as getting adequate sleep. Those are the four fundamentals that result in you living your best life or living a healthy life. Now, I don't want to go into what spirituality is defined as because it's different for every person. But if you have an appreciation of who you are in this world and have gratitude for that and a worldview that includes the other, to me, that's the best definition of spirituality. But these, when you look at these techniques, which are extraordinarily cost effective, such as meditation, they have a profound effect on mental and physical health. They just do. This has been proven over and over, and they're very cost effective. Unfortunately, medicine today has been infiltrated with a view that wellness involves taking a pill to prevent illness. And nothing could be further from the truth. And in fact, the four things that I mentioned to you, if you integrate those into your life, you will see that 80% of diseases that are treated go away. It's really that simple. You don't need all of these medicines. We have been deluded to believe that we are a species that inherently will get ill, and therefore we need these medications. Now, this leads to a much more complex discussion of how corporate entities have infiltrated our political system and have promoted corporate greed. And this then connects to the reality, and whether it's the pharmaceutical industry or the military industrial complex, results in essentially paying off politicians, whether they're on the right or the left, and fund them for getting reelected, and having these entities write legislation for them which is fundamentally against the precepts of democracy, fairness. And as a result, has contributed dramatically to the desperate situation that we're in as a country, within our politics, and fundamentally within our healthcare system.
So let's look at those four. The first one was food. And when you were talking about big pharmaceutical companies, the money they give to our medical schools, the money, obviously, that they give to politicians, we see their terrible undue influence. But when it comes to food, don't we also have to worry about big agriculture and big food companies? So many of the carcinogens in our food, the ingredients in our food, GMOs, et cetera, things like that.
No, we do need to look at these things. Now, GMOs are not all bad, so I don't want to characterize it that way. But what I would state is the following: what we have seen, especially in the food industry, is the consolidation of a large number of companies into a limited number of companies that controls huge swaths of our economy. Additionally, they will find the least expensive way uh, to sell their product. And what we see, and has been demonstrated over and over again, whether it's within the agricultural industrial complex or the pharmaceutical or the military, they will cheat. And this is what is irritating sometimes, because you have one group of politicians who say we need less government. No, we don't need less government, because in every instance to date, or corporate entities cannot be trusted in any way. It has been such a truism. Every time you don't keep an eye on them in the context of having legislature that is always checking, they cheat. And the reason they cheat is for their shareholders and for the corporate executives.
And that is what happened in the 1980s, this almost orgy of deregulation. Free the market. There was nothing free about it, of course. The money being going towards stockholders, CEOs, obviously at the expense of safety and health. So, as you said, it's an entire matrix of the industrial complex, whether it's insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies, big food, big ag, big chemical companies, gun manufacturers, big oil, and defense contractors. And I think it's helpful for us to realize it's one big matrix. And then you go from there to the realization that money in politics is the underlying cancer, because all of those companies have such undue financial influence. What we're saying here then is that in order for us to have a healthy America, we're going to have to recognize this is not just about treating disease. It is about such things as regulating our food. There was an article in the news recently that a lot of people saw about the difference between the ingredients in a bottle of ketchup in Canada versus the ingredients in a bottle of ketchup in the United States. And also all these companies that come over to the United States and spew toxins into our environment that they would not even be allowed legally to do in their own countries. A perfect example of this is St. Gobain in Merrimack, New Hampshire. All the PFAS, the vinyl chloride, they couldn't do it in France, so they come over and, of course, are allowed to do it here. I think this is all important because we have to take a more holistic view to what health is. So food. Okay, secondly, you were saying exercise. Do you have anything specific to tell people about how much we need, what we should do, and any ideas you have about making it easier? I mean, there are so many, when you go to some place like Holland and everybody's on a bicycle, and certain places where more people are walking. Do you have any particular thoughts about
Well,
exercise and how we can make that more part of the way
well,
our society
sure,
operates?
sure. Well, it's interesting because again, we see the infiltration of all of these areas by corporate entities who are fundamentally against our health. And what I mean by that is, I'm sure you know this, the automobile industry lobbied for us not to have
Mhm.
a rail
Yes,
system or other manner other than to buy cars and buy gas, and
mhm.
which has contributed to a massive amount of pollution and climate change as a result. So, certainly, I am not saying that everyone has to go out and be Arnold Schwarzenegger or some Olympic athlete. What we do know is simply walking, and it used to be 10,000 steps, it's actually 4,000 steps, is probably all you need. Simply doing that has a huge impact on your health. The other thing we need to recognize is that what we've seen is the destruction of our educational system. Children don't get recess, they don't get adequate exercise. There's a belief somehow there's not enough time, and so children don't get exercise, they don't get play, which deleteriously affects them. But again, it gets back to this larger issue of what we need to focus on is how do we promote human thriving from day one. And what that means is that we go to a compassionate capitalism and not ruthless capitalism. You mentioned something that corporations don't care, billionaires don't care. Now, I say that broadly, and I'm sure there'll be some pushback. Well, no, there is a
I
small
know a few
subset,
of you.
yes.
Yeah.
But the vast majority of billionaires could care less, except about their needs. This quote from Tolstoy, who said, there's a man on your back choking you. He acknowledges he's on your back choking you, but never does he offer to get off your back and stop choking you. And that is the way that the elite handle this system. And of course, it fascinates me because if you talk about changing the system, the argument will be, oh, you're promoting socialism. No, I'm promoting fairness where you give back the monies to the workers who did the who made the money through their efforts. And this is not communism. This is creating an environment that allows the middle class to live a life and not have now the middle class have food insecurity, financial insecurity, housing insecurity. That is a fundamental thing that has to change. We don't need any more $750 million yachts. We don't need people who have 10 homes that cost over $10 million a piece. We need to create a system. And listen, I'm not saying that everybody has to live at the same level at all, but we have to create a system that recognizes our responsibility to everyone else in our world. And that means that some people will have to change. And
You
and
know,
go ahead.
I'm s- no. Well, in the early days of our republic, do you know what public schools were called? They were
No.
called they were called common schools. And even when I grew up, because most of the kids went to public school, rich people and poor people were around each other a lot. Not only was there not this huge income inequality, I mean, we now have an income inequality so much greater than we haven't had it like this for 100 years. But today, people of great wealth, I believe what I've seen a lot. I've known some very, very lovely, wealthy people. Don't get me wrong, but it's very easy to emotionally buffer yourself from the suffering of other people when you have tremendous material wealth. You live behind walls on so many levels. I was talking to a very wealthy person the other day that was interviewing me. And I was talking about the 1 in 4 Americans who live with medical debt. I was talking about the high poverty rate. I was talking about the 1.3 million who, ration their insulin. I was talking about the people having to work 2 or 3 jobs. People, 1/3 of our workforce living on less than $15 an hour. All the kinds of people that you were talking about, the kinds of situations. And his response to me was, Marianne, I'm out there. I just don't see this. And I just said, of course you don't see it. They're not in your neighborhood. And I think American society has developed this way of making sure that certain people get to live a certain lifestyle, and whatever suffering results from that, because the system knows we have a conscience, make sure it's on the other side of town or the other side of the world. I remember when I moved to Santa Barbara, California, and I just moved there, and I was reading an article in the local newspaper, and it said that there was a law being passed that you couldn't sit on the sidewalk. And I said to a friend, why would they pass a law saying you couldn't sit on the sidewalk? My friend said, hello, Marianne. Any homeless people who are around here, nobody, they don't want to inconvenience the shoppers. They don't want you to have to see this suffering right in front of you. So we'll just give people, they'll criminalize, they're criminalizing poverty,
Poverty. Yep.
criminalizing homelessness and so forth. Um, so I think that it all goes back to what you were saying before, when you don't recognize the suffering of the other. And if you don't see it, you don't necessarily, because America, it's really interesting. You probably remember this. You remember decades ago, it was in a land far away, it feels like now. Like you were talking about when people could actually afford homes and so forth. There was a little girl who fell down a well. Do you remember that?
Yes, yes.
The whole
Wasn't that
country held its breath. Did they get her? People were meeting like at the water cooler in the afternoon. Did they find her? Did they find her? Um,
this was a girl in
so
Texas, I think it was.
yeah, wherever it was, and so when we see one suffering human being, people's hearts are touched. But we have this capacity for denial and grandiosity when it's no, it's many thousands. 12,000 children a day on this planet starve. And it's something, and that does go back to the brain, doesn't it? This capacity.
Well, there are two issues I'd like to comment on. First, when you mentioned this individual who said, "I don't see that," well, a couple things happen. One is cognitive dissonance occurs because if it was in your face every day, you could not possibly do it. So they create a narrative and they avoid the situations where they have to face that. The other aspect of this is from a neuroscience perspective, when you most of us function by recognizing that we need other people. And because, I need a ride there. So I have a friend who has a car and they're a good friend and they'll take me. Rich people, they don't need anybody. Everybody is a commodity that can easily be replaced. And studies have demonstrated that when that is the case, this essentially separates you from people of value, which is typically people in their same wealth class, to simply a commodity that if they don't do what you want, you get rid of them. And there's no sense that you have a responsibility to those people. I heard one of the most disheartening things earlier today and it was a story about Elon Musk, but he said something, one of the most horrible things I've ever heard, which is something like, "I don't have to go by the rules. I'm rich and I do what I want. And if it costs me money, I don't really care because I'm so rich." I mean, what could be a more insensitive thing to say? To basically say, I do what I want. I can run over anybody I want. I can treat anyone and I can get away with it because I'm rich. And unfortunately, this has become a narrative for so many people of great wealth. Now, listen, I'm not implying that I'm not wealthy comparatively. I am in the top 1%. But I've had people say to me, well, the reason I like Trump is I have my 401k is X, Y, or Z. I said, I don't care about my 401k. I care about the person on the street who's hungry. We
I
have to
think,
take a shift of how we
yeah.
look at the world.
And it's important that we remember that not every rich person is a greedy bastard. It's important that we remember, and I believe this is true. I think for the vast majority of people who have created wealth in this country, they don't want to feel that their capacity to create wealth is at the expense of someone else's ability to do so. But I also think you have a good point. There are enough ways to buffer yourself from the realization if you're not admitting that in fact that is the case. So these are the kinds of changes in the way we view things. You're right. I think we have created a society where rugged individualism is transitioned to rugged narcissism. My taxes are better. My taxes are lower. Therefore, it's a good policy. Maybe yes, maybe no. Depends on what tax bracket that you're in. So the next one you talked about is spirituality, and you and I would both agree spirituality is the path of the heart. And you're right. You could be living a certain life where you have all your material needs met 1,000 times over. But if anything about that condition is hardening your heart, then you're actually decreasing your health. And because your capacity to deal compassionately with other human beings is part of what makes you healthier. The last one you said, I find very interesting, this business about sleep. I think, Jim, there's a big conversation these days about ever since COVID and so many people were working at home. And a lot of people, you were talking about the billionaire class. So Michael Bloomberg said this has to stop. People need to come back into the office. I do understand that there's some face to face contact, which is great. But I also know as an author, as someone who has been self employed and is self employed, those 20-minute naps mean a lot to me in life. And I am often aware that if I worked in an office, I wouldn't be able to say, I just need a break. I need to walk around the block, or I need to lie down for 20 minutes. And I do think, Jim, that lack of sleep is a bigger issue in terms of the debilitating effect on people's lives than a lot of people realize. So say a little bit more about your feelings about that.
Well, I think there are a variety of issues that interfere with sleep. Stress and anxiety interfere with sleep. You
Also,
know,
social media.
well, we'll get there. But stress and anxiety, if you're worrying about whether you're going to be able to pay your rent or feed your child, that creates an inability to sleep for many people. Then, of course, that gets exacerbated because you have to work, and then you're not as efficient, you're not as productive, and then that has a ever growing effect on everything that's going on around you. So I think that's important. You mentioned taking a nap. In Japan, as an example, they allow their employees to take naps at times, and because they recognize that if you have an adequate amount of sleep, you are more productive. But this idea of productivity and creativity actually is important in our overall discussion. When you create an environment, if you will, that is compassionate, uh, people end up being happy at work. If you're getting paid a living wage, if you're not working excessive hours, if people recognize you need time to yourself, if they recognize the importance of family, this changes everything. And this is sort of an interesting contrast because there's a belief that, well, the way I get people to work is I intimidate them. I create a fear environment that makes them more productive, and that is the best company. The fact of the matter is, if you can create an environment that recognizes the dignity and the importance of every employee, huge things occur. Healthcare
Absolutely.
costs go down dramatically. Human resources costs go down dramatically. People are much more productive. And in fact, in those environments, you cannot pay them enough to work as hard as they do because they want to work. They are inspired by their work. And then this, of course, rolls over to their family life and all these other areas. And people are more creative, they're more productive, expenses are less. And this costs nothing. That's what's extraordinary about this. It costs nothing to create a compassionate environment. And fortunately, we're seeing now a lot of companies beginning to recognize this. What I find amusing is that I'm sure you recall prior to the pandemic, restaurants and service companies said, well, we can't afford to pay more than minimum wage. Well, my gosh, what happened after the pandemic where people said, no, I'm not going to do that. Enough's enough. There's a dramatic increase in pay, and these companies are saying, "Oh, okay," and they now know employees will not stay if they don't get paid a reasonable salary. And it's analogous to when restaurants, as an example, or stores, they were told you can't allow people to smoke. Oh my God, the store's going to close, the restaurant's going to close, nobody's going to come in. What happened? They were just as busy, and a large percentage of the population was gratified. Somebody finally recognized this and did something about it. And there was a dramatic increase in smoking. So
Another
go
Another
ahead.
example of that also has to do with corporate tax rate. Oh, if you lift the rates of, the taxes on these corporations, they'll just leave. And you're like, well, it used to be that they were that high and they were all here, and they in fact don't leave. So it's just these fear
Well,
tactics,
yeah,
right?
that's exactly right. It's a fear narrative that's always the backdrop for all of these politicians or corporate entities. In fact, I'm sure you recall when Eisenhower was president, we had, I think, one of the highest tax rates
Mhm.
ever, and
And he
he
was
was
a
a
Republican.
Republican. And in fact, his policies today
Would be
would,
considered far left.
yes,
The
absolutely.
Roosevelt wouldn't even be let in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, so it's sort of fascinating, this shift from one of an agreement of our need to support everyone and create an America that supports happiness, if you will, to a polarization to the point where there's a ruthlessness and this promotion of this rugged individual narrative that the reason you fail is your fault, when
Yeah.
in fact it's not your fault. We have created a political system that ruthlessly tries to take away from the individual, the person who's making the living, and give it to corporate entities. I heard a talk by, I can't remember his name, but it said, we have a system of corporate welfare, and if the company ends up being successful, of course, they keep all the money. So we spend government money to bail out failed corporations over and over again, and then they still get to keep the money. If we
Not
did
just
this with
failed
the
corporate.
individual, well, no, you're right, but this is
Corporations
ridiculous,
are
right?
making billions of dollars in profit. We then subsidize to the tune of billions. And John Stewart talking to Janet Yellen the other day, he was talking about why is it that Walmart doesn't pay its people enough. So the people then have to go
Go on
get food
welfare.
stamps and so forth. So you and I are paying. So Walmart gets to keep all the money and we the taxpayers. If
No,
I hear one more time from my friends who keep telling me, you really like them, they're really lovely people, and they start all these art museums. And I've said,
yeah.
yes, they're very lovely people. That becomes irrelevant at a certain point.
Well, no, but no, you're exactly right, and this is what's so horrible in some ways is when uh, that is exactly what occurs. I mean, we are subsidizing Walmart several $billion a year because they don't adequately pay their employees, and this is over and over and over again.
Yeah,
Uh,
and these
Go
tens
ahead.
of billions of dollars to pharmaceutical companies. If you put the largest five pharmaceutical companies together last year alone, they made an $80 billion profit. But they say they need our subsidies for
There,
development and research, like they don't
yes.
have the cash on hand. So
Well,
I'm
I
sorry,
was
go
just going to throw out another one, which is
on. Okay.
we've seen the highest profit in oil companies,
But
yet
we're
people don't understand that we massively subsidize them. They should get no subsidy whatsoever. Uh,
none. In fact, they
None.
should be their fossil fuel extraction should be
Or how can we have a system where it is illegal to ask for discounts from the pharmaceutical industry by our government? Who would ever think to do something like that? We should tax them as appropriate. And it's also, how could we create a system, as an example with COVID, where we literally gave them billions and billions of dollars to develop vaccines, and we get nothing from it? We should get a significant amount of that profit that goes back to the taxpayers to support programs that help everybody.
well, you know that I agree with you. And you said it very well early in this conversation. You said we should promote policies that help people thrive. And I think that's the point, everyone. When we talk about the idea of a healthy society, it's not just about how we treat disease, it's about every little thing. It's how we treat each other. It's how we treat ourselves. It's how we treat the earth. It's our reverence for food. It's our reverence for life and for human relationships and communities. And we're not going to have a healthy society until we recognize that all these things are involved. And we simply cannot have a meaningful conversation about any of that without talking about economics. And that's where James Doty and I always agree. It always gets back to that. As long as we have a rigged economic system in which corporate power and short term profits for huge corporate interests are placed before the safety and the health and the well being of human beings, then we are going to have the destruction of our middle class, the destruction of our environment, and the destruction of our bodies. So, Jim, I think you and I agree we are at now a critical point. And I
Well,
think that my sense, very much, I have to tell you, Jim, I've said this a lot recently as I travel the country. A lot of the things that you and I agree on, that you've been talking about here today, you and I have been saying these things for years. But my experience is that 10 years ago, even when I would start talking in the ways you and I are talking here today, a lot of people's eyes would glaze over. A lot of people would say, well, I think that's going a little too far. Not anymore. Not anymore. I think we have a critical mass of Americans who really do understand this, who really do understand there's a level of corporate tyranny at this point, and really do understand that people's lives are falling apart. Our environment is falling apart. Our democracy is falling apart. And now the question has moved from, is it true, to what are we going to do about it?
no, I think that you're absolutely correct. I think that people are beginning to recognize that it is a rigged system. It would be what's so sad is that if you look at how much money there is, and not only in the United States, but around the world, that is completely being wasted when you could create human thriving for everyone in this world. If you get rid of a lot of these barriers, if you don't spend trillions of dollars on weapons, uh, it's just appalling. It's funny. I was with the King of Bhutan a few weeks ago, and of course they have the gross national happiness. But the interesting thing we were discussing is an idea that I have been promoting, which is this compassionate countries index, where we look at how does an individual feel that the country is doing for them? What is the country actually doing in regard to healthcare, free education, uh, uh,
Free
uh,
college.
free
Yeah.
college, or free or decreasing the number of people in prison,
Yeah.
all of these things. And then you look at what is the responsibility of the country to the rest of the world, and that gets back to what you were talking about: is sustainability, dealing with climate change, helping our brethren in less developed countries, not manufacturing or selling weapons of mass destruction. And you look at these and actually systematically evaluate, and it'll give you a very, very clear picture, one, of who's doing it right, but also a model for how we can create a country that actually looks at the individual in the sense of how can we help you, not how we can take away from you.
I think that that is the essence of spiritual health and ultimately mental health and physical health. And we're beginning to understand that they're all one, different facets of just what it means to be a healthy human being, and ultimately to have those values reflected in public policy for the creation of a healthy society. So,
Absolutely.
as usual, Tim, I think you're great. I appreciate your words. I appreciate your wisdom. Everyone, this is Dr. James Doty that you've been listening to, his book, Into the Magic Shop. You can look him up. That book is just wonderful. He has another one coming out next year called Mind Magic. And share this Firelight chat with your friends. We need to initiate a season of repair, a new beginning. And I think that so many of us are feeling sad and lonely and depressed and frustrated and angry about the way things are. But there's a phrase that's often used in Alcoholics Anonymous. You get sick and tired of being sick and tired. Let's just start over. We have enough information. Jim has articulated so much of it here today about what's wrong. And it's been 50 years now, 50 years in which very destructive capacity policies have dominated in the public sphere. And we see what they've done to our health. We see what they've done to the middle class. We see what they've done to the earth. Now, for the next 50 years, we need generations who are going to be about the business of repairing that which has been broken. Okay, we're going to heal that which has been wounded. We're going to start over. We're going to do things a different way. And James Doty, no one articulates what that is better than you do.
You're a
So
sweetheart.
thank you, my friend.
Well, listen, you take care. Always a joy to be with you. And I just want people to remember oftentimes you feel that it's just you, but it's not just you. There are millions of people like you. But what it does take is for you to stand up and hold hands and demand fairness in this world.
Including politically, and you have held my hand. You have endorsed my candidacy, and I thank you very, very much.
Always a pleasure.
God bless you.